All right, Maude. I know we have been working on scheduling this conversation for many, many months. It's really great to meet you. Welcome to the show. It's good to have you on.
Thank you so much. It's fantastic to meet you.
You as well. Um, there's a lot I want to cover in the conversation today. And I think the first thing that might be important for me to note about it is that on this show, I've done a couple of episodes about wokeism and which trials that seem to be happening in our culture, McCarthyism. The article that Bari Weiss wrote about you, it was noted as creeping totalitarianism. Those are subjects I've covered on the show, but I've never actually talked to somebody directly who has suffered at the hands of that kind of change in America. And so I want to give ample time to allow you to tell your story in detail. And I think it might be helpful just to start at maybe the beginning of your career. We're going to talk a lot about the Legal Aid Society in general, but that's an organization that, as I read into it, has a very noble mission, and it's one that you have dedicated a huge chunk of your career to working for. How did you learn about the Legal Aid Society, and how did you begin to get involved in the first place?
Oh my goodness. That is really starting way back.
Yeah.
Beginning. I interned at the Legal Aid Society when I was in law school. And just FYI, the Legal Aid Society is New York City's largest public defender agency. And public defenders, for those who don't know, represent people accused of crimes that can't afford a private defense attorney. We have a constitutional right to have a defense lawyer when you're accused of a crime. You don't have a constitutional right, for instance, to have a lawyer in civil court or in housing court or another. But when you're accused of a crime and your liberty is at stake, you have a constitutional right to an attorney. So even people who can't afford an attorney, if you're homeless, if you're mentally ill, if you have any sorts of problems, you get an attorney. In New York City, you often get a legal aid attorney. I interned there in law school. I went to work at the Legal Aid Society right after law school. I've worked in both the Manhattan and the Bronx borough offices in the criminal defense division. I have worked as a staff attorney there. I have worked as the director of training new incoming lawyers straight out of law school about how to be a public defender. And I will say, although I am currently in a lawsuit with the Legal Aid Society, it's an awesome job. It's a great job, and I loved doing my job there for many, many years. On and off for 2 decades, I worked there. I took time off when my kids were born. I have 4 children, and they actually factor into this story because they are New York City public school children. And when my kids were in school, I got very involved in basically education advocacy. And it was that those education positions and education advocacy positions that I was championing and working towards that created the rift between myself and my employer.
Yeah. And I want to get into that story specifically, but initially, what was the appeal for you in the first place to get involved in something like this? I mean, I know you're a lawyer. Going to law school is expensive. Living in New York City is expensive. Why did you want to work there in the first place?
Helping people is, it's like a privilege and a joy. It's, there's a lot of different ways to practice law. And I wasn't really interested in corporate law and trusts and estates and in sort of the stuff that wasn't to my liking. Criminal law was pretty fascinating. And both the legal part, the sort of legal theory part of criminal law is very interesting, but also the day-to-day of having clients and helping people who are often at a really terrible part in their life. They're in jail or they're facing criminal charges. You're meeting people when they really need an advocate and they need someone to be on their side and they need somebody to fight for them. And, I liked every aspect of that. Part of the job.
And I also want to give some context as to who the people are who tend to need the assistance of the Legal Aid Society. I would imagine people who've already heard the description you've given about the organization can guess, but who tend to be the individuals in New York that rely on these services in the first place?
And I mean, there's a whole gamut, but obviously, it's a means tested eligibility. So if you're rich, you don't get a legal aid lawyer. You have to go find a lawyer. Crime tends to be a young person's game a little bit. So you tend to have, not exclusively, but you tend to have people who are younger. And there's certainly, lots of young Black and Hispanic men go through the criminal justice system at rates greater than other groups in terms of, gender and age demographics.
Yeah. And I would imagine, given that you spent so many years working with them, your heart must go out to people like that who are in a situation like that. And I would love to get your thoughts on why you think it's important that people of that description are given, you've already mentioned that there's a constitutional right, but just personally, why is it important to you to represent those people and help them?
Well, it's funny. I was just having lunch with somebody and we were talking about the stop and frisk program under Bloomberg, our former mayor, and under Bill de Blasio. And so, in addition to individual human beings who you meet and who sometimes you care, I care about many of my clients very personally. You work with some clients for years, actually, but you see, when I first started working at the Legal Aid Society, it was in the late 90s. And it was before a lot of changes and reforms happened. So the stop and frisk program, which was ultimately found to be unconstitutional the way it worked in New York City, was at its height, right? So being a young Black or Hispanic man in New York meant being almost indiscriminately stopped and searched, basically because of where you lived and what you look like. We had for many, many years, for decades in New York, drug laws called the Rockefeller drug laws, which were draconian. That's the word that everyone uses. And it's the right word, right? People, first time, arrestees, people could wind up facing 3 to life or 15 to life in jail for a first time drug offense. And I mean, we have drug laws for a reason. I'm not a complete abolitionist when it comes to, we see the excesses in both ways, right? Like the locking up so many people for such long sentences it didn't make drugs go away or didn't make drug sales go away in New York City, but it ruined a lot of lives, which doesn't translate to the idea of having no laws or decriminalizing everything. So I'm living in a New York City right now where I think the pendulum maybe has swung the wrong way or too far in the other direction. But I think the changes that we saw to ending the stop and frisk program as it existed when Bill de Blasio came into office and reforming the Rockefeller drug laws so that we could have more humane drug laws. Those were good changes. There were changes in the right direction. Some of the current changes to law that we've had, I actually disagree with. But the fact of the matter is, I represented teenagers who are going to prison for really long sentences sometimes. And when you see the human cost of laws that are not, right, that are really deeply unjust in some ways. And also, I'll say there's a lot of talk in New York right now about bail reform. And it's very frustrating because the impulse for bail reform in New York comes from a good place, I think, right? The idea that access to justice shouldn't be based on how wealthy you are, right? Yeah. Like you should have a justice system where a poor person or a rich person or a middle-class person can be treated the same. And bail reform was born out of the idea that access to justice shouldn't go to only those with deep pockets. But because the laws were so bad for so long in the other direction, I think there's been an overcorrection, and we're seeing it right now in New York City in some of the, the things that have gone wrong in the last few years. It's like an overcorrection. That's a whole nother story separate from my story, but that's just my political commentary that the pendulum swings both ways. And it had swung to when I started working at the Legal Aid Society, people were being penalized with really sort of horrifically long sentences for nonviolent crimes. And it was awful to see. So I very much supported changing the laws to make things more fair and more reasonable. Some of the most recent changes have probably been, for me, it's like the pendulum has swung too far in the other direction.
Yeah. And I'm glad you brought up politics because, what we're going to talk about today is deeply linked to politics and the zeitgeist of politics in America right now and your own personal political views. I know you're running for Congress right now.
Yes.
I would love for the listeners to know a little bit about your, historic political views. In my research for this conversation, you were a donor to Bernie Sanders. You've been a lifelong Democrat. Speak to that. Talk about what, in your life has mattered politically and why in your life you have aligned yourself with the Democratic Party and just the political beliefs in general that you do.
Yeah. I've registered to vote when I turned 18. I registered as a Democrat. I've been a Democrat ever since. And probably the easiest and simplest way for me to know why I chose to be a Democrat is my understanding of the Democratic Party was and has been up until very recently, because I think we've maybe gone off track a little bit, but was and has been looking out for the working man, looking out for the everyday American. And we weren't the party of the oligarchs, of the vested insider interest. It was the party of the labor movement. It was the party of working everyday American people. At least that's what the Democratic Party has been traditionally. I think we could put a question mark near that right now with some of the things we see coming out of DC. But to me, that's really important. A thriving middle class in America is really essential to a successful America.
Yeah. I want to get into the specifics of what happened at Legal Aid. Because I think for a lot of people, as we've kind of already alluded to in this conversation, who are aware that there are popular phrases in American culture right now related to wokeism, they might know, roughly speaking, what that means. But I'd love for you to begin to talk about what you started to notice at Legal Aid. And I think it was also, if I remember correctly from your biography, it was really in the education system at first that was causing your own objections. What did you see that started to raise your eyebrows and was being introduced to kids? You said already that you're the mother of 4, that you thought was wrong and unethical.
Well, I'll say this. I wound up running for my school board, which is in New York City. It's called a Community Education Council, for kind of the same reasons that lots of moms and dads like all over the country do, right? Yeah. Like they were building a new school in where we live, a new middle school. My kids were in elementary school at the time, my 3 eldest, and my youngest hadn't even been born yet. And I started going to a few meetings and started paying attention. And I went to a few of these school boards and was like, what's this about? What's happening here? Because I grew up in Pennsylvania. I was born in New York City, but I didn't grow up here. So I hadn't gone to New York City public schools. So I was learning about it as we went along. My husband's not from this country, so he didn't have experience with this school system either. And I wound up running for my school board and got on the school board. And in the simplest terms, there was sort of a divide among parents. And the divide was sort of, I'll say, pro-academics versus equity. And Equity, dictionary definition of equity meaning fairness is who's not for fairness and equity, right? It sounds good. But equity became code word in New York City for education policies that were really intent on tearing down academically strong programs in schools and tearing down merit-based admissions, meaning if you had to take a test or have your grades measured in any way to get into a school or a program, that was considered bad because it was not equitable, because it was racist, because it was, something that the super woke left didn't like. I am summarizing this in very simplistic terms. If you had been going to school board meetings in 2018, 2019, like so many things that we now see on Zoom, these things raged on for hours on end with parents yelling at each other and carrying on and having endlessly detailed conversations. But the real thick of it, like the real basic part of it, came down to, do you want to get rid of every honors program in a school and every advanced math program in the name of equity? Or do you want to support strong academic programs for public school students and recognize that there are racial gaps and help all kids of all colors do better so that we can close some of those gaps by providing opportunities to everybody? And I very much fall into that latter category.
Yeah. And I think once you begin to delve into the details of what is going on in that situation, right? My understanding is that, if you ever have large groups of people in the thousands or tens of thousands, there expectedly will be differences in outcomes based on whatever group you break them down by.
Right.
What was the primary objection for the people who were pro-equity, right? I mean, it tends to be, in my reading of the literature, often Asian Americans that come out on top in a lot of these SAT scores and testing into merit-based schools. Where were they coming from, right? To give them the benefit of the doubt, why would they have this objection to ripping down traditional, what really are standards in American schools? What's the genesis of that? Where does that come from?
Well, I'll tell you what's funny is that we were having these battles, school board battles, and it was in the papers, and there were all these political battles because our mayor was very involved in making some of these proposals to get rid of merit-based programs in New York City. But we weren't alone. The same exact battles, really to a T, were happening in Boston and in San Francisco and in Virginia. And at schools that were merit-based schools and that were very successful and that overwhelmingly tended to be Asian, more Asian than white in many instances in terms of the kids who were testing into them. I mean, in New York City, Asian kids make up somewhere around 15% of the public school population. And in some of the most successful high schools, they were well over 50% of the kids who were testing into those high schools. And it's worth pointing out that the schools often fixated on the racial makeup of the schools, but the socioeconomic makeup of the school is worth understanding. This wasn't rich kids getting ahead. Often the Asian American populations in those schools were first generation kids or immigrant kids who are coming from homes where English was not the first language, often kids coming, the poverty rate of those schools was higher than surrounding schools. So this was not, and of course there were not kids who were not in poverty in those schools too. It wasn't an exclusively below the poverty line, group of people. There's a great diversity in the schools. But we saw just recently there was a court decision in the Thomas Jefferson School that said that their program to make the school more diverse, meaning decrease the number of Asians and increase the number of Black and Hispanic students, was unconstitutional. The parents of that school, of the Thomas Jefferson High School, sued to change to revert back to their older admissions, to their merit-based admission standards. And basically, we just saw, as we got involved in that fight in New York, we realized at a certain point that parents all over were having the same fight. And for me, it's also very much an issue of public school versus private school, right? If private school kids in New York City, which it's a very wealthy city, there are some of the finest private schools in the country are in New York City. If private school kids can have advanced math programs and learn at accelerated paces, like, why can't we have great public school high schools programs too? Why can't we have an advanced calculus class in a public high school. And the only way you can do that is if you group together kids who are prepared to do that level of work. And in New York City, because we have so many failing schools and so many students that we have failed to teach to grade level, if you go to a lottery system, which is what the pro-equity crowd wanted, specifically for the purposes of engineering classes by race, you wind up with kids that are at such a wide range of ability that you can't teach to the highest tier of ability because you just don't have enough kids in a lottery-based class that can do that level of work. Yeah. We need to screen kids by ability. It's no different than what we do on sports field. If you say like we're not gonna do tryouts to be on the soccer team or the football team or the tennis team, we're just gonna do it by lottery. And the kid who swings the racket and misses every time is going to be our star tennis player. It doesn't make sense, but that kid may be brilliant at something else. Like you have to help kids find what they're good at. And we don't tend to question that so much when it comes to arts excellence or sports excellence. And it's become a weird issue with academic excellence, and it shouldn't be. We should certainly create spaces for kids for young people to achieve their academic excellence.
Yeah. I grew up in Pennsylvania too. I'm from Erie, and there is something to me that is just so fascinating about this entire subject matter, because I went to public schools and there was a just understood level of ambition in America at that time when I was growing up, that you aspired to get into the honors program and you had to work for it. It was something, it was an honor to be in that. It was something that was encouraged by everyone in the community. And then it seems like something has changed in the last 5 years or so. And I'm wondering for you, who I'm sure has thought quite a bit about this, why now? Why are these ideas percolating to the level that they are, where you have a committed group of people who are advocating for the equity policies you just outlined?
Yeah, I think it goes back way further than 5 years in terms of the ideas being out there that inform this conversation that's reached a sort of pitched battle in the last few years. It's just sort of come to a head now, right? Yeah. And in these school battles that we've seen in different cities, it's reached this sort of fevered pitch now. It is really strange, and I don't have a brilliant answer for why it is happening right now, because it's also sort of strange if you think about it, that right at the moment where like some of our great successes as a society in terms of being more tolerant, right? Like we have gay marriage now, we've had our first Black president, right? Like I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and like those things weren't a given. If you had said to my parents in the 1970s, like we're going to have a Black president named Barack Hussein Obama, and gay people are going to get married and have their weddings in splashy New York Times editorials, and people aren't going to blink an eye about not everyone would have been convinced that wasn't a given. And it's a credit to America. It's a credit to our long march towards being more tolerant and more accepting and truly diverse. And right as we're reaping some of the great, what I see as benefits of being a diverse and tolerant society, we have a chorus of people screaming their heads off about how awful America is and how intolerant we are and how deeply racist we are. And it's like, you feel like saying, wait, what country are you living in? Because I'm living in a pretty wonderful country, not a perfect country. And not like we don't have room for improvement. We all do individually and we do as a nation, but like, let's take a deep breath and realize how amazing this country is, which is also why, by the way, so many people from other parts of the world want to come and live here, including all these immigrants who are striving and working hard to be successful in a public school system, to be academically successful, to live that great American dream. And I'm pretty horrified when I see people denigrate that.
Yeah. I think it's also just important to note that for a lot of these kids who test into a school like Stuyvesant, this is their shot. This is their opportunity to move from the working class to the white collar class in one move. And my understanding about the idea of the SAT and tests like that in the first place were largely implemented for a merit-based society to more clearly advocate for a society that wasn't based on superficial characteristics, but really was a merit-based civilization. This conversation so far has been largely theoretical and about ideas and contradictory ideas, but it gets personal with you. And I'd love to have you speak about that transition point when you went from disagreeing with some people who were advocating for these equity policies to then speaking about those objections yourself personally, and then what happened to you. You can take as much time as you'd like to tell that story, but when did things actually begin to affect you personally with your job?
Well, I'll give you the really short version up front, and then I'll just
please
fill in the details. I was the president of my school board, and I testified at a city council hearing and talked about some of these changes that were being proposed to get rid of merit-based admissions in New York City schools. Nicole Hannah-Jones, who was a New York Times reporter and who wrote the 1619 Project, was covering the education beat for quite a while at the New York Times. She heard me testify, and she invited me to an interview, and she interviewed me, and we spoke, and there was clips of that interview wound up on there was a news program that the New York Times produced and it was about the then chancellor in the New York City schools and these proposals to get rid of merit-based admissions programs. And she and I then had some exchanges on Twitter, and there was I said, I don't want to misquote myself, but I said something to the extent of that you have to listen to people, even if, and this is what I had actually said about the chancellor when I testified, that even if you think someone is racist, you have to listen to people who are stakeholders in the same system. And so public school parents, there are Republicans and Democrats. There are people who think Donald Trump is evil spawn and people who voted for him. And there are, people, you're not required to come into, as a public school parent, there's no litmus test of ideas before you become a parent in the public school system. People with very different ideas send their kids to public schools. And I tried to, as clearly as I could, express the fact that you have to be able to sit down and have conversations with people that you may really disagree with. And then in the subsequent Twitter exchanges I had with her, I referred to these schools that we were just talking about in New York City as majority POC, people of color. And she called that disingenuous because because those schools are largely Asian American. And a lot of people on Twitter complained about that and complained that she was sort of denigrating Asians and saying they weren't people of color and that. So at any rate, I wrote an op-ed to try to present my point of view. I mean, it wasn't particularly long and I didn't think particularly controversial, but in a way, that Twitter exchange illustrated the point I was making, which is a lot of Asian Americans were offended by her words. They thought it was racist of her to dismiss the idea of those schools being majority people of color because they were Asian. It's like, she's a public school parent, or at least she was at the time of that interview. She had a kid in public school. So some people thought it was racist of her to be dismissive of Asian Americans, but she's still a public school parent. She still gets to come and present her points of view, just like I'm a public school parent and I get to come and present my point of views. We don't have to agree with each other on everything to be able to sit down. And more particularly, what I was writing about is we had shared goals. Making sure that our schools are truly integrated and have great high quality academics was something that I think we actually completely agreed on. So instead of calling each other racist all the time, why don't we just accept the fact that we won't agree on all of the methods of how to get to what is in essence a shared goal, great high quality public schools that are truly diverse. Some people think we have to get rid of hard tests and merit-based admissions. I disagree, but we can still recognize all of our shared goals and still recognize that we have a lot of things we could work towards together. At least that was my pitch, and that was my point of view. My employer at the time, the Legal Aid Society, was deeply offended by what I wrote. And they, I don't want to put words in their mouth if they were offended or not. They wrote basically a screed against me, condemning my words and imposing sort of a race-based litmus test for what you're allowed to say, right? It was basically, as a white woman, I didn't have the right to say the things that I was saying. And they said rather specifically that I couldn't do my job because of the thoughts that I had. I don't want to go into too much detail because we're in court, but that's not okay for any employer, not for my employer to have done in the way that they did, or for any employer to do to Americans. We really do have, it doesn't matter the color of your skin, for you to have ideas that are different from your boss or your employer. I have every right to share as my points of view. I was writing as a public school parent. I wrote a 600-word op-ed in a newspaper, and I shared my point of view as a parent. And, as an American woman who's free to have the ideas and thoughts that I have.
My understanding is that it was really after the publication of the New York Post article that you wrote that shit really hit the fan for you.
Basically, and yes.
I want to read something from Bari Weiss's article. I thought she framed this very well, and there's some just information in here that I think might be useful to share with people who are listening to this. This is related to the op-ed in the New York Post. This is from her article. On July 23rd, 2020, Maron published an op-ed in the New York Post under the headline, "Racial Obsessions Make It Impossible for New York City Schools to Treat Parents, Kids as People." Here's how it opened. And this is from you, I presume. So correct me if I'm wrong about any of this. "I'm a mom, a public defender, an elected public school council member, and a city council candidate. But at a city Department of Education anti-bias training, I was instructed to refer to myself as a, quote, white woman, as if my whole life reduces to my race. Those who oppose this ideology are shunned and humiliated, even as it does nothing to actually improve our broken schools. Though facing severe budget cuts, the DOE has spent more than $6 million for the training, which defines qualities such as, quote, worship of the written word, individualism, and objectivity as white supremacy culture." She says after that, this is Bari now, that's when things at work blew up. 3 days after she published the piece, the Black attorneys of the Legal Aid Caucus put out a lengthy statement saying Maud Maron has no business having a career in public defense, and we're ashamed that she works for the Legal Aid Society. It declared Maud is a racist, and openly so, and offered no evidence to back up that charge. It said that this veteran public defender was a prominent opponent of equality and a classic example of what 21st century racism looks like. I don't know if you've heard that in a while.
It went on and on and on. Yes, I haven't actually heard it for a while. It sort of takes the breath away.
Hearing that now, I know this happened a couple of years ago now, but what are your thoughts in receiving that kind of feedback from people who were your coworkers?
Yes.
This is an organization that is designed to help largely Black and brown poor people that you worked for many, many, many years. What do you make of that?
I mean, at the time, it was so hurtful and so painful and so awful. I have some perspective now. And oddly enough, I think many people have more perspective now. I think being accused of racism is a miserable thing to go through, particularly when there's really literally no there. But I think enough people, maybe not everybody, but enough people now have seen laughably absurd accusations of racism, like, "Oh, I like pink, you like purple, you're a racist." I mean, it's like people are accused of racism at the drop of a hat these days. And, at the time that this was going on, it was like people were talking about cancel culture and is it real and is it not real? And there are some people who might tell you cancel culture is not real, but like, there's no denying that people have had their careers ruined and have been chased out of workplaces. I mean, I've certainly lived it, but other people have too, over absurd allegations. And this is a really clear-cut case of, of people weaponizing that accusation because they disagree with you about something. And in this case, it was something actually fairly, I think reasonable people can disagree over the subject. Like, I think merit-based admissions in public schools has real value, and it has particular value to low-income, low socioeconomic status kids. I think it's also helpful and valuable to my kids, to middle-class kids, but I think it has real value. Smart, reasonable, good-hearted people could disagree with me and have an sane conversation about that, and accusing people of being vile human beings because they have a different opinion than you do about how to fix schools that need fixing is just not a rational, and it's certainly not a compassionate or kind way to respond to anyone, certainly not your coworker.
And what happened to you right after this assault was launched on you by your former coworkers? You no longer work there. What proceeded in the coming months after those statements were made about you, those allegations were made about you? Did you willingly leave? Did you feel like you were forced out? What happened to your job specifically at the Legal Aid Society?
I mean, at the time I was running for office, and so I wasn't in the job day to day. But I mean, here's the thing. I don't see how anyone, not only that was a caucus of attorneys within my union. It's a unionized office. That tweeted that statement, but my bosses, the legal aid leadership, retweeted that statement, essentially endorsed that statement. And then they wrote their own statement, which was equally vicious and insane. I don't see how anybody can actually be expected to work in an office where those things were said about you, and rather explicitly, the claims that I can't do my job because of who I am and what I think and what I said were made in writing and published by my employer. So, there's something called constructive termination in the law. Like, they don't have to do the Donald Trump, you're fired to fire you, but they can essentially, effectively fire you by running you out of the office in the way that they ran me out of the office.
Yeah. I want to read one other quote from that article. And this is a little bit later in the article itself. And this is a quote, I think, directly from you. If you had asked me when I became a mom what I thought were the pressing concerns my kids would face, I probably would have said climate change, maybe ending the Iraq war. I am so shocked that that what I worry about now is creeping totalitarianism in America. You've spoken to this already in this conversation, and this is one of my favorite quotes, that reasonable people can disagree. We're all doing our best to try to figure out what in the hell is going on in the world. And part of living an educated, free life, in my mind, is having an open mind, being able to disagree with people, changing your mind when you think it's appropriate, and not forcing other people to believe everything that you do. To me, that is the essence of illiberalism. We're having this conversation in early 2020, and I know what's happened to you has gone on in the last 2 or 3 years specific to this issue. How do you see things now related to the creeping totalitarianism that you so worried about? I think for most people who don't know someone like you, the idea that cancel culture is a myth and doesn't exist, it's easier to just believe something like that because you don't want to think something like this is actually happening. How do you think things have changed? We've had elections in the past couple of years. I do think that because just personally, people like you have refused to shut up and to have had the guts to actually speak their mind. It does seem like things from my perspective are changing a little bit, but I'd love to hear your analysis of that from your perspective.
I guess I would say it's not, we're not all moving in the same timeline at the same, so I think there are some people, many people who read about my story or read about similar stories and realize like, Houston, we have a problem.
Yeah.
This is not how you run a free society. It's not good for democracy. It's not good for individuals. But there are other people who, like you said, never met anybody who got canceled from a job. Don't they think like, I'm American, I say what I want, what's the problem? And they just haven't experienced it or had it impact their lives or their friends' lives. So they're not really convinced that this is, an issue or a problem in society. And there are other people who are much more tuned into what's going on. I mean, I wrote about this recently, but it's like what gets labeled as misinformation online these days is not misinformation. It's unpopular opinions. Remember for the first year of COVID, we couldn't mention the lab leak theory.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know where COVID started. I don't have the skills or the knowledge to figure out whether this virus came from a lab or whether it came from an animal, as we were told, in the beginning. But I've read lots of credible, smart, interesting analyses from other people. And I think whether they're right or wrong, we certainly should be able to read and assess for ourselves what other people think about that. And I don't want to live in a society where my government says, we don't like that theory, so we're going to call it misinformation and kick it off of the public square of information. Because I want all the ideas, the good ones and the bad ones, to be in the public square so we can assess for ourselves what makes sense and what we think.
Yeah. A few weeks ago, I talked to John McWhorter about a lot of these topics, and his book, I think, along with stories like yours and your willingness to speak openly about what happened to you, I think is part of the pushback against this creeping totalitarianism, which I think was very aptly put. And his term that he uses for people who are adamant about pushing for equity, and more than that, are fully willing to discredit someone and ruin their reputation and try to get them fired from their job, essentially ruin their life with no compunction, as the elect. That's the term he uses for people who have this. And there is something fundamentalist about this that reminds me of religion. And part of what I have wondered in the last 10 or 15 years as the country has become less religious, and it is in that vacuum, especially for leftist types. And I certainly was one of those at one point in my life. I still consider myself a Democrat. But that void that is filled by uncertainty and a need for a team and tribalism, it seems like this is one of those areas that has filled that void for a lot of people. I know in the article that Bari wrote about you, you were mentioning the book White Fragility, and these are books that are very popular. I'm wondering what you think about that, in terms of just from a more like an anthropological perspective, how you explain this modern phenomenon of people that have such certainty about their views, and they're so certain about it that they are totally fine with ruining somebody's life in its name. How do you think about that?
I think John McWhorter his analysis is really spot on when it comes to the religious fervor of that, the woke racists, right? Of people who want to sort of reify race in a way that they think is defeating racism, but really for the rest of us looks like they're reinvigorating racism. In New York City, we have, and not just New York City, I've seen it all over the place, but these concepts that very much fall in line with white fragility, called affinity groups, where they're dividing, the teachers in one of my kids' schools were divided by race to have these race-oriented discussions. And they've divided kids as young as middle schoolers by race. And it's gross and it's wrong. And I can't be convinced otherwise. I just don't think in a diverse, beautiful, thriving, city like New York City, that any good comes of dividing kids during the day for instruction by race. Now, mind you, I went to a women's college. I think if you want to go to a Jewish organization or an African-American organization or a Latino organization or an Asian American organization, because you're celebrating shared history or common history, fine. If you want to go to a Bible group that's not divided by race or gender or you can go to groups that are where you have like interests or where you're celebrating a shared heritage. There's nothing wrong with that if you're doing it voluntarily. But kids in a public school system should not be divided by race. And it is it has complete religious fervor to it. The Kendi defined anti-racism that has really infiltrated the public school system. I mean, massively infiltrated the public school system. And I think it's wrong. And I just think that we have to be if you start a private school that says we're going to put all the white kids in, room A on Tuesdays and all the black kids in room B. Okay, well, anyone who wants to sign up for that and pay good money for it, go for it. I wouldn't send my kids there. But public schools have to be for the public. And it's a different beast, right? Yeah. Like we have to be able to live up to our ideals in our public school system, and the religious fervor of white fragility style curriculum and thinking really betrays basic American principles and values in a way that I think we need to resist and reject.
Yeah. And so much of what you've already talked about, these sound like Fox News talking points. These are, I'm just thinking about people who I know who politically have agreed with me and kind of been on my side of voting in my lifetime. I don't know that they would really believe a lot of what you're saying. They would have a hard time believing that this actually is happening. And I think part of just selfishly, one of the reasons why I think you're so important is because you are within the tent historically of my own party too. I consider myself far less identified with a party than I ever have in my life. And I kind of increasingly hope more and more people feel that way as well. But for those people who don't have kids in school, who haven't heard about these stories about children being separated that you just mentioned, what are some of those details? What really is happening at some schools in the country related to what I view as just blatant racism going on with children? What do you know about that? What has happened?
I mean, I know, look, the example I just gave you of a middle school is I know about because friends of mine, their kids go to those schools, right? Yeah. Like that's something where I've had parents call me and say, I'm so distressed at what they've assigned my daughter to read in her, 7th grade class. And this is what they're doing. And this is what they're discussing. I'm so upset about what just happened in my son's, high school class. And I'm fielding those phone calls from people that I know, from people that I don't know, who are reaching out to me because they know who I am. So like, I see it going on and I see what's going on in my own kid's school. And I've set up meetings with my kid's principal to talk about things that I find troubling in my own kid's school. But you can also read about it. It's out there. It's not, there's a fantastic organization called Parents Defending Education, located in Virginia, that's done a really fantastic job collecting some of this information. And it's out there. At this point, it's so well documented that people who choose to disbelieve it are just being willfully blind to what's going on. And, it's funny you say Fox News talking point, because it's like, you really shut down all conversation when not you, but it's someone who does it when you essentially you're saying, think like I think, or else I'm going to label you as a bad guy. I'm going to label you as the other, as the heretic, as the, as the wrong think person. And part of me being a Democrat and part of me being of the left for as many years as I have been is because for me, that was a place where classic liberalism thrived, where Enlightenment values and testing out ideas and being thoughtful and really trying to use, critical thinking to come up with the best solutions for our most pressing problems. That's where I thought that fervor and energy was best represented. And the truth is, politically, my values haven't really changed at all. But the ground has shifted beneath my feet rather extraordinarily. And I know I'm not alone because I hear it from so many other people.
Yeah, I feel exactly the same way. When I was a kid, the Democratic Party was the party of free speech.
Yes, of course.
And the tent that all the weirdos could be in, who had different ideas. And specific to education, how do you think we get out of this? I know you are running for office yourself, and I want to give you time to talk about why you want to do that and how you think you can help the situation. But how do you assess the current state of education in terms of how we might be able to work our way out of this? Are you optimistic that that's even possible at this point? I would love to get your thoughts on that.
Well, I'll say there's two things. One, I think there's a very robust parent activist element in New York City, other cities as well. And we've actually connected with parents from other cities, we New Yorkers. That is hugely important. It's also gratifying. I love working with the parents that I work with. I had a meeting this morning with a group of parents. And I think the work that we do as parents and that I see other groups throughout the city doing as parents is crucial and vital to insisting on the kind of education we want our kids to have. We are the stakeholders. We are the parents whose kids are in these schools day in and day out, and we have to keep doing what we're doing and fighting. And some of that is political, electing the people who share our values and who will promote the kind of education we want to see, and voting out and getting rid of the people who have betrayed those values. There's that. But then I also think there's a role at this point for the kids to play. Like, kids know when they're being lied to, right? And there's so many kids who have basically come up in the woke theater of it all, where, when you're being forced to pretend that your world is one of racial oppression, where white people are just oppressing the heck out of all the non-white people, but yet you're actually a diverse group of kids who are friends, and you hang out together, and it's nonsense, and you can see with your own eyes that the richest kid in your class may not be the white kid, and that the smartest kid in your class, may not be the Asian kid, or that there are true individuals sitting in front of you, and there are jerks of every color, and there are geniuses of every color, and there are good people of every color. And so this really facile narrative of Black-white oppression and racism, I just think kids are seeing through it. But then again, I also worry because kids are very young and impressionable, and where some of this stuff is being filtered down to ever younger kids, sometimes they have to they don't have to, but sometimes I fear what happens is kids do get a little indoctrinated, and but their ability to shake it off is part of the solution. Their ability to realize that they're being lied to is part of the solution. And so helping kids realize that everything they're being taught isn't always true is part of that, that move forward. And I'll say this, for instance, you said that I'm running for office. So I'm running for office and I'm running in a Democratic primary. There's an incumbent who's 76 years old and has been in office for 30 years. So she's trying to embark on her fourth decade in Washington, D.C. There's also young 20-something, super woke, super lefty challengers out there. And I don't want either. I want me. That's why I'm running. Or someone who thinks like me. If someone could come along and say, don't worry, Maud, I'll fix things, I'd be okay with that. But I don't, one of the challengers is a socialist, self-declared socialist, who works for Google, making a very pretty penny, working for a very non-socialist organization. And then, like I said, we have this long-time incumbent. I just don't see how that far left extremist position that I don't think is good for my city or my country or my kids or their school. I don't see how that helps families like mine who want a safe city, a safe subway, safe schools, who want high quality schools, who want, who want to be free from ideology and just have government that's actually working to try to solve solutions. And I certainly don't see how the status quo that got us here is going to suddenly start fixing these problems tomorrow, right? Yeah. And so I like how many people are stepping up to run and to challenge the status quo and to say, like, this is not a contest between the far left and the permanent political class, which is what some people will have you believe. We need new voices, and we need fresh voices, and we need people who are, for me, I want people who are going to reject this extremist left-wing ideology. New York City is a very blue city, so we most often our elections are decided in the Democratic primary and not actually the general election. And I'm not interested in having to choose between a permanent political class that has abandoned families like mine and far left progressive lunacy. And I say that as someone who always considered myself progressive and of the left, but what we've seen of it in New York has been a disaster. And, I want the middle path. I want the smart, sensible, let's focus on solutions and on real people. And in New York City, for me, some of that's not about education. Some of it is about looking at how disastrous lockdowns have been and mandates have been for personal liberty, for our economy, for, everyday working people. I mean, it drives me insane in New York that the healthcare workers that we were applauding for and clapping for last year got kicked out of their jobs this year because we refused to recognize natural immunity and had vaccine mandates that had no give in them. No, I say this as a woman who's vaccinated for everything under the sun. I'm not remotely anti-vax, but that label, that refusal that you and I were just talking about of having of people having different opinions than you. You may think, hey, there's good reason to not recognize natural immunity and we should all be vaccinated anyway. But if that's your opinion, lay it out for me in a way that makes sense and that I can listen to what you're saying instead of just labeling anyone who disagrees with you as anti-vax, because that's just ad hominem and it's not a conversation.
Yeah. And to also label that person as beyond the pale and unworthy of any kind of respect. And we've already spoken about this a little bit during the conversation about why this is happening right now, why people are so apt to castigate people who they disagree with. One thought I had when you were just speaking now is that I think a problem progressives often have is admitting when progress has been made.
Yes.
and conceding that point and to find other avenues in life that might be worth their energy to pursue. A question I did want to ask you too, related to all of these subjects, is how large you think the group of people is that is pushing back against what to me sounds like very sensible views that you have. The people who are animated related to equity, the people who were interested in removing you from your job or making it so inhospitable for you that you had to leave. Are they simply the loudest and the most intolerant people, or do they actually, in your judgment, make up a significant percentage of the population in general? I mean, my personal read on this is that a lot of the reason why these groups have been allowed to have such power is that people are just scared to confront them. And you said this earlier related to, when I was a kid, if you were called a racist, that was one of the worst things that could ever be leveled against you. And I think especially for a lot of white Americans, they've been trying their entire life to distance themselves from anything remotely close to that traditional sense of the word. But I'd love to get your thoughts on that, about how large you think the people are in the population that are actually advocating for these totalitarian viewpoints.
I'll ground the answer in a very political answer by saying that I'm very in favor of open primaries. Andrew Yang, who ran for mayor in New York, is promoting this concept pretty, strenuously. And the reason I'd love to see open primaries in New York is I think if we had more people voting in primaries, we would net out more in the middle, more in the moderate positions that you and I seem to share. Yeah. But primary voters, and in New York, particularly Democratic primary voters, but this is true of both sides, tend to be extremist. And so what we get sometimes is the people picking our elected leaders are a small portion of a smaller group, right? Yeah. So you have to have the people who are registered to vote, the people who will actually turn out to vote, and the people who can vote in the primary. And so it skews the results. I think the vast majority of Republicans and Democrats if you're doing a Venn diagram of what they care about, what they're concerned about, what would actually motivate them to pick an elected official, there's more similarity than not. There are real differences. I'm not trying to be Pollyanna about it. Like there are very real differences, but there's a lot of shared concern and shared interest. And our current system is driving us to these extremes. And then when you're driven to those extremes, when you have an elected government that's like we've had in New York City, that's using the threat of accusations of racism or transphobia or white supremacy or ableism, or, the list gets longer and longer, then people get scared and then they get quiet. And then it's like, you know what? I'm not a culture warrior. I just want to do my job and pay my mortgage and take a vacation once a year. I don't want to fight this fight. So I'm just going to not say anything as I sit through this diversity training at work because I want to keep my head down and get out of here, with my shirt on.
Yeah. This is something, I don't know if you know the name David Daley, but David Daley is, I think, one of the nation's experts on gerrymandering. And I had him on a couple of weeks ago. And it was
gerrymandered right out of my previous district and into a new district for this race. So
I don't have to tell you about this.
Yeah.
but he, to your point, it's essentially the second order consequence of what has been the result of successful gerrymandering is primaries that are becoming more and more extreme. What the end result is for that. I know we're getting close to the end of the conversation, and I'd love to talk to you about, as we wind things down, what you think the sensible path forward is for the country related to these subjects. We're having this conversation on the 28th of February in 2022, and it's been a harrowing week watching the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. But I have to say, it does seem to have mobilized something in the West related to, I think, what are the best aspects of our society that gives me some optimism that we may be on the cusp of reawakening from this slumber, and taking pride again in principles that are the bedrock of our civilization. The first and foremost, to my mind, being freedom of speech and liberty, and the ability to disagree with your neighbors. You are, I've heard this been written about you in terms of describing you as a political candidate, as a moderate Democrat. And I don't know if you would agree with that assessment, but I was thinking when I was just hearing you talk about the 2012 election between Obama and Romney, and it seems like a different time. I mean, those men had significant differences between the two of them, but they had a lot more in common than I think most of us recognized at the time. And I'd love to give you an opportunity to talk about what you think for the Democrats, but more just the country in general, where we can go to have a sense of civic pride and an ability to navigate our way out of this creeping totalitarianism that exists. And it's not unique to the left necessarily. I mean, there are dictatorial tendencies on both sides of the aisle. But how do you think we navigate those waters to get to a point that, in my judgment, the most amazing country in the history of the world can continue to be that? How do you think about that personally?
Well, I'd say there's two things. One is I'm with you on how important free speech is. The next generation needs to know and understand that. One of the most scary things that I hear is when there's this lunatic concept that the First Amendment doesn't cover hate speech, which is not remotely true and also really dangerous, right? This idea that we could, remove people's YouTube channels or remove them because you can call something hate speech. It's quite dangerous. But speaking of YouTube channels and speaking of new media, I actually think the fact that you and I have had a conversation that lasts for an hour is part of the solution. It's not the whole solution, but the fact that so many Americans are turning off CNN and legacy media and seeking information elsewhere. And it's a bit chaotic out there because there's a lot of misinformation. You just mentioned Ukraine. I've read, this many soldiers died on Snake Island, this many soldiers were captured on Snake Island. It's like you can feel the propaganda coming at you from each way, and you don't know what to believe when you're getting those. War is chaotic, and you're getting waves of information that that you don't know what's trusted. But I don't think, oh, I'll turn on CNN to figure out what's really going on, because I don't trust that I'm not going to get, more propaganda of some form. So I think creating new media outlets and new ways to disseminate information is super important. Having trusted voices, I'm more likely to read a Substack of an investigative journalist that I trust and that I think is a credible source to get information. It's not the same as nightly news. I'd love to have a nightly news program that I turned on and thought like, oh, they're going to tell it to me straight. But I tend to seek out voices, and whether it's on Substack or whether it's on Twitter or whether it's, a podcast that's credible to me. And I think lots of Americans are doing that. And it's both a little scary because it's very fractured and people wind up in their echo chambers but it's also the path forward where people say, I need reliable information and I need thoughtful conversation and information. And so I think that what we're doing now, which is talking to each other and having intelligent conversation, it is part of the path forward. How that shakes out the people who are in the business of media, how that shakes out, and how as Joe Rogan's platform explodes and MSNBC and CNN shrink, someone's going to have to come along and figure out how to make a TV program that interests people as much as long form podcasts seem to be interesting people these days. And that's not my job, and I'm not going to be the one to do that. But someone's going to come along to figure out how to, take new media to the next level, because people are looking for it, right? And in a supply and demand society, like there's a lot of people demanding better and different alternatives for how they get their information. And I think that's part of the solution to keeping America great in all the ways that we are a great and wonderful and amazing nation, a nation that people want to come to. And also, fending off the things that you and I are both worried about.
Yeah. A couple more questions before we wrap this up. One I would love to ask you is about, I grew up Catholic, and for all of its flaws, I think one aspect of Christianity that is worth holding on to is the idea of forgiveness. And there seems to be very little of that available in the public sphere right now, to my mind. And I'd love to know from your perspective, I mean, you have gone through a hell of a lot in the last few years. And I have a ton of admiration just personally for your unwillingness to lie about what you saw in front of you. But it is a fact that you have colleagues that didn't have a problem saying the things they said about you, and to effectively end your career at that organization as they did. Let's say hypothetically in a month, a year, many years from now, they watch a conversation like this, they learn more about you, they read some criticisms of books like White Fragility, and they realize that they were wrong. What would you like them to know? What would you like to say to people like that, who have caused an enormous amount of suffering for you and your family, I'm sure? What kind of message do you think you would like to convey to them? And maybe more specifically to people in the country who've been through something like this, what do you think is the right long-term response to an event like that, and approaching people who canceled you and really disrupted your life in the way that they did?
That's such a great and interesting question, and nobody has asked me that before. So that's a really interesting question. There's been some real viciousness directed towards me, and what I think I have done for the most part. Obviously, I have a lawsuit going on, and that requires, being very functional and finding an attorney and approving, complaints and that sort of thing. But other than doing that, which, I'm somewhat well suited to doing, being an attorney myself, but Other than that, I have, for the most part, just kind of compartmentalized.
Yeah.
Like, it's like, this is this awful thing that happened. I'm putting it over here. I'm shutting the door and I'm going on with my life. And I don't tend to think too much about the people who were so vicious. I'm not that invested in whether or not they realize that that what they did was vicious and cruel. Like, they have their own path to walk, and they may continue to think exactly what they thought when they wrote those vicious words for the rest of their life, or they may change their mind, or they may come around, they may think differently. But that's their path to walk. And it's not really, it's not one that I'm going to invest a lot of time in.
Yeah. Last question I want to ask you, and I think you're right about this new media. And to me, it's like the Cambrian explosion and evolution, where what is now available to people in terms of learning is like nothing else that has ever existed before. And there's obviously a massive appetite for, I think conversations like this one. I mean, I'm a fan. This is what got me into this work in the first place, because I feel like it really opened up my mind, podcasting and YouTube podcasting in general. And I have a deep gratitude for living in this time, because I do think it broke me out of some of my own ideologies that I think is just helpful for any human being who wants to live rationally and morally. And the last thing I'd like to know from you is who you trust, right? I mean, for people who are living in this chaotic information age, and they're looking for individuals and media organizations to look to trust, to try to make sense of the world with as much honesty and accuracy as they can. Who, in your judgment, is doing the best job in that department right now? Who you trust and you would seek out for information?
Well, I'll tell you off the bat, I think Bari Weiss does a particularly amazing job. And not only her Substack and her podcast, but it just, she's been hiring additional writers and bringing in new voices. And it's invaluable to gathering information and understanding what's going on in the world. I'm a huge fan of Matt Taibbi. You mentioned people who critique white fragility. If you
I've read it. Yeah.
His take on white fragility, you should, because it's a great analysis, but it's also just will make you laugh because he really doesn't pull his punches on that one. I also read Glenn Greenwald a lot. I think his commitment to free speech and to holding the powerful accountable has been really sort of consistent. And he's, someone who seems to piss off everyone, which is a mark of a truth teller. Yeah. So that's something that I think is a good thing in someone. I read also recently Batya Ungar Sargon's book, Bad News, speaking of new media and where we go from what she sort of chronicles how the mainstream newspapers that we've relied on traditionally, how they started and how they got where they are and where they're going through a real populist lens. And I really loved her book. I listened to John McWhorter and Glenn Lowry a lot because I think they are just morally really clear-sighted and fun and thoughtful to listen to. So there's a lot of voices out there that I think are worth listening to.
Yeah. One of my favorite quotes that I've gotten out of doing this podcasting work in the last year was from a guy named Jonathan Zimmerman, who had written a book. He's a professor at Penn, and he had written a book about free speech. I think the title of the book is Why Free Speech Matters. And the quote that I remember most from that conversation is a line that, if I remember correctly, his name was Leonard Hand, gave at an immigration ceremony in 1944 at Central Park. And it was like a mass swearing in of thousands of Americans in the middle of World War II. And the quote that he said in his speech addressing these new Americans was, "The spirit of liberty is that which is not so sure that it is correct." And I've thought about that quote a lot. We all want to believe we know the truth, and I think we should all aspire to try to get the truth. But it is always a noble endeavor in every generation, in my mind, to fight against the forces and propensities for totalitarianism. And I hope to God we are not anywhere close to that actually taking over the country. And I've already said this to you before, but I have such admiration and respect for people who take that on at high cost. And you have done that, which is a big reason why I've wanted to talk to you for so long. So it's an honor to be able to talk to you about all this, because I think these conversations really matter. And I think your example is especially important in this time. So thank you so much for doing this and having the conversation.
It's been a pleasure to talk to you, and I appreciate the questions. It's always great when someone asks you a question that you haven't had before or that makes you think about something in a new way, because like you said, it's where, it's what makes this podcasting format really interesting and enjoyable. And so thank you very much for inviting me.
Absolutely. I wish you all the best. And thanks again for doing this. It was great to meet you, Maud.
Thanks so much, Dan. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you for listening to this episode of Keep Talking. If you're finding value in this podcast, please consider supporting the show via the links below on Venmo, PayPal, or Patreon. Your support helps to make these conversations possible.